What's going on, everybody? It's Matt, aka the Lumberjack Landlord. Super excited to be with you today. This is actually breaking news. Kind of can't believe it. Couple of weeks ago, we actually got notified that one of our tenants' children actually had a high lead test. We've actually been working with the tenant, and today was inspection day. And so the reason I want to share this with you folks is because, again, we always say it, I always say it, it's not all fun being a landlord. So we'd gotten the call back a couple of weeks ago. And what basically happens like that in our state thereafter is you get notified by the state that there was in fact a high test. That literally was a process of about 2 weeks. And then they set a time in the schedule where they then come and do an inspection on the property. To give you guys an idea of what that inspection is going to look like, I'll cover that very shortly. But to kind of cover the main basics of a high lead test in somebody that's younger than 5 years old and younger, basically what they do is the state then notifies us that they first were examined in their doctor's office, that they got a test there. What was really interesting is they got that test there, and then they went right from there right to a lab to get an actual PCR, so an actual blood draw test. That blood draw test actually came back at a fifth what the doctor's office test came back at. So something, again, I'm going to share this entire journey with you guys. I want to make sure that you see all the different pieces and parts, all the different moving parts and pieces that go with this. But again, came back with a high test at the doctor's, then came back with a test that was only 20% of that was in the doctor's on the actual lab test. However, that test sadly was 1 point higher than it can be to trigger anything. So everything gets triggered. Those results get sent directly to the state. The state then notifies me, hey, this is exactly what's going on. They don't share with you any of the lead results. They don't share with you any of that stuff. But because I have a great relationship with my tenants, they were able to let us know, hey, this is what happened. And this is what the amount was, et cetera, et cetera. So obviously being concerned, we certainly talked to the state. The state said we can be out there in this amount of time. I think it was about 10 days or so. And so today we actually did the walkthrough inspection. Now, so for those of you who have never been through this before, one of the things to note is that lead paint was the primary paint used before 1979. In almost every paint that you'll find, lead was existent. The reason it was used was because it would adhere better to surfaces and would also reduce mold and mildew growth, believe it or not. So what's really interesting about that is being in New England, guess what? About 90% of our construction in residential, about 90% of that, you guessed it, it is going to have lead there. So the concern always is first safety for the child, and then understanding what the next steps are. So now it's on a state level. They then show up today, and for all intents and purposes, it's basically a super radar gun, but it's this amazing device. They cost about $16,000. I know because I asked. But this device, they then go into each of the units. Couple of rules about each of the units. This in particular was a duplex. What's really interesting about a duplex is that in this particular duplex, there were no shared areas. Everybody has their own isolated access to their own units. What's furthermore interesting about that is that in my state, if one unit gets a higher than acceptable lead test, if they get a higher than acceptable lead test, then they look at any other units in the building if there is a woman that is pregnant, or if there is a child under the age of 6, 5 or under in the unit. So I actually, actually, those are the two criteria. And so I actually had to reach out to that tenant. I basically had to ask the question, do you have any young kids in the unit? And she said, actually, I just had a son. So that checked the box for saying now they're not just going into the one unit and common areas. Now they have to go into both units. So, as you guys can imagine, having done this as long as I have, I know that lead paint doesn't magically disappear. I know that in every building that I buy, because almost every building I buy was built before 1979, it's going to have lead paint in it. Period. End of story. Way it goes. So the challenging part is that when we go through this process of acquiring these units and then, essentially making ready for the tenant to move in many cases, we're pulling a permit and we're actually going through the entire unit. We're going down to studs or something of the like, but a permit's pulled, all this work is done. In this particular place, we actually just went through and essentially did a make ready, what we'd call a lipstick job. So putting in some LVP flooring, swapping out the cabinet boxes, new appliances, and basically going through because it had vinyl windows. And we basically went through and we painted all the walls, windows, and trim. So all that was good. So excited about that, but you're not off the hook, because when that gun actually gets used and it gets put up against that trim, it doesn't go 1 layer deep. It doesn't go 2 layers deep. It can go 37 layers deep all the way to what's called the substrate, which is the wood or the base or the door. Usually that's what's tested. So what's really interesting is the concept of what the state considers a hazard versus what a normal layman would consider a hazard. What's really interesting about that is that I look at a piece of trim and say, yeah, that piece of trim is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. They look at it as not, is it fine? Is it flaking? I would think flaking, sure, hazard. Okay. Not flaking, still a hazard. Here's why. Things like sills on when you're looking at a windowsill, right? That base windowsill and then the apron, that's what's the piece of wood underneath. Because that piece protrudes from the wall more than a half an inch, it now becomes something that a baby, somebody 5 and under, baby and toddler, something that they could actually bite on. Because they could bite or chew on it, they are now at risk of becoming lead poisoned. So they basically start going around the house, making a map room by room. And essentially, here's the things that they were looking for, so you guys know what to look for when you're actually looking at a unit and figuring out, how do I take care of this to make sure that it's lead safe moving forward? So the main areas that they looked at were, one was they actually looked at how far away those windowsills protrude from the wall. Also the apron piece. That's the first thing they look at. Second thing they look at is door jams. Anywhere where there's a friction point of a door to a door jam, they look at all of those, because in many of these New England homes, those doors are original. Those doors are 50, 70, 80, 100 years old. They've been there that long. They have the antique handles and the old skeleton key locks. They're really cool doors. We like to keep those in properties because they look cool. But sadly, they had lead. Kind of to be expected, just one of those things. And the inspector will always say, well, we don't know until we check. That's basically so they can check absolutely every single thing that they want to check. So we've covered so far windowsills. If they protrude more than a half an inch, that's considered a biting hazard. That's going to get flagged. The second thing, doors. That's going to get flagged in pretty much every way, shape, and form. Third, this one, again, kind of standard, which is baseboard. If the baseboard protrudes more than the width of your index finger, i.e. half an inch, if it protrudes more than that from the wall, that is also considered a hazard. It's a hazard because in the future, the potential is there, they believe, that a child could eat or bite that and become lead poisoned. So now that we've covered number 3, number 4, this was the one that kind of wowed me to the point of like, yeah, this one was a frustrating one. The original wood floors in the house, at some time they were refinished. One of the big things that was done back in the 70s and 80s was they would paint or 60s and 70s is they would paint the floor. They would paint the floor because there wasn't a big thing about refinishing floors back then. That's really a much newer thing, like kind of the last 2 decades. They would actually paint the floor. Kid you not. Well, guess what? When they would paint the floor pre-1978, 78, 79, that paint has lead in it. So they actually got on hands and knees, put that ray gun to the floor, and it didn't score anything on the wood. And then they tried it on the nail heads. It didn't score anything on the nail heads. But if you've ever seen a 100-year-old house with the original pine floors, the hard pine, you will see every 5th or 6th board, you'll see a little bit of a gap. And they tested inside that gap. And while the number was very, very, very small, it was barely over 1. When a normal piece of trim that has lead paint on it is normally ranging between a 16 and a 22. The floor had just over a 1. And so now that is going to be posted on the list as well. Their fix to that is that they will expect the contractor to clear out that hole with some sort of a hanger, I was told, and then go back and find a way to get in that slit after anything has been removed, and then go back and then remove and then test again. What I find amazing is that I asked how that is a hazard, because look at the amount of work that you're having to do to get to it. They said, well, the possibility exists that a child could have something in their hands, could actually dig into that thin crevice, and then they could eat it, and then they would become lead poisoned. I'm sharing this with you because it's more than a little bit frustrating for somebody who takes really a high level of pride in the units that we bring to market. And the fact that the conversation's always there about we need affordable housing. I can't deliver, and no one can deliver affordable housing if you're expected to bring it to this level that it's never been before. It's just really hard to do that. And you just can't do that on a budget where you can then rent it out and be able to do it at the numbers that are considered affordable. So this was the very first day of all of the pieces that went into essentially what I know is going to be a coming lead order. I'm going to get a lead order. When that lead order happens, it's going to be quite the process. We then have to meet with somebody called an assessor, where that risk assessor basically walks through the building for hours and takes their special ray gun and hits every single surface in the entire building. When they hit every single surface, they will come out with a risk assessment document. Once they come out with that risk assessment document, we then have the conversation on the phone of, here are the acceptable ways to deal with this. And then they will create that statement of work and they will put it out to bid to state contractors that you then have access to use. Now they have a grant program, but I haven't gotten into a whole lot about how that grant program is. They have another program where you actually take out a loan against the property, where they put that lien on the property on the deed. And when the house sells, the bank's in number 1 position, they're in number 2 position, and whatever's left over, you might get if you decide to sell. So as always, I always want to share the truth with you guys about here's all the fun stuff about being a landlord and the great income that it can be and all that. And then here's one of those things that sadly, in the 22 years that I've done this, this is my second one. Only second out of 121 units and over 3,000 tenant years. So just one of those things that sadly it's kind of like hitting a bad lottery, because well over 100,000 homes, hundreds of thousands of homes in New Hampshire, in New England, certainly in New England, but in my state, New Hampshire, hundreds of thousands of homes have the existence of lead paint that would be considered a hazard. So we have to work with this government agency to make sure that we A, make the property safe again for kids, and B, we are now on their timeline. So we will be waiting for that. What will be first will be the lead order. After the lead order, we will then have the risk assessment folks contact us to walk that. We will then get that report. Then we will talk about how do we address that. And then the real fun begins. Part of this issue is that I, as the landlord, have to find housing for the tenants that are currently living in that building. The rule is that they have to pay rent, but I have to pay for where they're going, and I have to pay for the costs to get them there. So I don't know that this is really the best process, but I'll make sure to share every single step of it with you guys. That way you know exactly what we did, what we had to go through, what the next steps were in taking care of this. But I would encourage you guys to at least understand kind of what lead orders are in our state. We actually give out a pamphlet to any tenant, and it's not actually a pamphlet, but it's actually a piece of paper. Pamphlet's the one that they do in person. Piece of paper, it's actually a document that you can just print off. We make that part of the lease that everyone signs. However, it doesn't preclude any of this happening. Everybody knows that anywhere you want to live is going to have this, unless it's non-affordable housing. It's much more expensive. Then usually it's either new enough where this stuff is not an issue, or B, it's been redone, so it's not an issue. So while that's horrible news, the good news is the child's fine. No signs. Everyone was shocked. No inclinations that there was any issue. However, it's still state and federal process of what we have to do to now go down the path of cleansing the house of lead. So I will make sure to keep you guys in the loop. I will update you guys as we make progress. I suspect my next video will be probably sometime next week on this, after I've gotten the lead order. I will take you guys through it. So real quickly to recap what we covered today, which is number one, it is certainly any sort of protrusion from the wall, i.e. a windowsill, that is considered a hazard if it has lead paint on it. Certainly old doors where they have their striking area where they actually will strike when they close. That is a high friction area that can create lead dust, which would then create a test or a high test or a lead poison rating. The next is certainly they check the floor. In addition to the floors, they also check some of the thresholds, and a bunch of the thresholds were fine, but one threshold was not fine. So that threshold is now on the list as having to be remediated. And then lastly is one of the things that we didn't cover yet, because there really wasn't an issue in this building, was old windows. Old windows that are wood windows that have been painted. Those, every time they go up and down, the idea is, or the belief is that they create dust. That dust is from lead paint. That lead paint would then create lead dust. That lead dust then creates a high lead test in a given child. So thankfully, a majority of the building is all new vinyl replacement windows, but there are 3 old windows that we are going to have to replace. I'm sure they'll be on the report, but that will be something we do. So this is going to be a long process. My expectation is it'll probably take about a week to get the order. It'll probably take another week to get on the phone with and get the assessor out there. And then it will probably take another 2 weeks after that before we actually have a plan in place. And then my guess is it probably takes another 30 days after that before they can actually start the work. So I expect, my hope at this point is just that we can be wrapped up by the end of this year on this unexpected and challenging project that we have no choice but to undertake. So as I always say, we try and create fantastic content for you. Please hit that like button, subscribe, but most importantly, share this with people. If anybody has any idea what a lead order looks like, or what that process looks like, it's a scary process. Share this with them. Give them the ideas. Make sure that they're being proactive and in front of things, making sure that if there are any hazards that exist and they are going to buy something and they are going to inherit an empty unit, do the work then before anybody moves in. Make sure that you've gone through the right processes. Make sure you've gotten the right permits to do all the work that needs to get done. In some cases, it's a certified professional. In other cases, you as the homeowner can actually do that work. But I would encourage you, Be proactive, make sure that you look at these things and make sure that you at least understand that they're there. Because in 22 years, this is my second one. The first one almost bankrupted me twice. So I'm encouraged to be able to share this experience with you. Sad that I had to go through it again by myself. But that's the way the mop flops. That's the way it goes. And so we'll just do the very best that we can and work with them to get this issue remediated. So let me know what you guys think. Put the comments down below. If you have more questions, if you have things that you want me to be watching out for, I will certainly make that available, that information available. The other thing that to keep in mind too is we're not going to cover a lot of this on the live stream on Sundays because there's so many questions there about kind of other day-to-day stuff. So we'll really kind of keep this lead issue just to this set of videos that we'll continue to produce for you guys. So again, thanks so much. I hope you guys have a fantastic day. I'd be willing to bet on this. It's probably a better day than I had today. But again, hit that like button, certainly subscribe. Make sure you hit the notification bell because this will become a playlist on the Lumberjack Landlord. Thanks again, everybody. Have a fantastic day.